Hi folks, Matt here from the RCR podcast, and today we're going to talk about what is biodiversity net gain. So we're really rocking and rolling on the dry subjects at the moment, but this is a hot topic, and probably a great deal of the inquiries coming into our consultancy at the moment is around biodiversity net gain. Now, I'm going to reference the legislation. I'm going to talk about how it should be done. However, you do need to bear in mind that a lot of local planning authorities do have supplementary planning documents, and at the moment there's a bit of a mishmash approach right across the UK as local authorities get their head around exactly what they need to be doing. So yeah, you need to cut everybody a little bit of slack at the moment, I guess. It can be a very, very confusing subject for all of us. So I will very briefly touch on Wales and Scotland and what the situation is there at the moment, but predominantly this is going to be about England. So let's jump right in. So what is biodiversity net gain? Biodiversity net gain, or BNG, or a net gain assessment, essentially it's a principle from the Environment Act 2021 whereby developers must ensure that habitats for wildlife are enhanced and left in a measurably better state than it was before development. Now, the way that is done is through capturing data on site, and that is all based on making sure you've got very, very accurate mapping, preferably a proper topographical map. So yeah, BNG, it isn't just a recommendation, it is a legal requirement under the Environment Act 2021 for certain types of developments, and we'll get on to exemptions in a bit. So there is a mandatory 10% increase. We have experienced some pragmatism from some local planning authorities depending on the type of scheme. So we've got a customer that is installing electric vehicle charging points on the edge of car parks, and it's very, very difficult to take BNG seriously in that particular scenario. So it just depends on the local planning authority, but just assume from day one that you're going to be looking at a mandatory 10% increase. So that basically means you've got to improve biodiversity by at least 10% compared to the pre-development baseline. So what you will find from that it very much depends on what is sitting on site as existing. This is calculated using a biodiversity metric provided by Natural England, which is essentially a very, very complex spreadsheet full of macros on the back end. Nobody really understands how it works, but we put the figures and information into that, and it spits out a figure at the other end. And we can obviously manipulate that metric depending on what habitats you're looking to create on site. So the calculation of BNG is done using this biodiversity metric that assesses the quality and extent of the habitats. Now, exemptions. So there are some exemptions and exceptions. So householder applications are generally exempt. This includes extensions and modifications to existing homes that don't involve a new separate dwelling. We are seeing some pushback on that, but householder applications are defined in law. It's defined in the Town and Country Planning Act, so it may be that there's the opportunity to push back there. But like I say, what tends to happen then is if BNG isn't mandated by your local planning authority, quite often they'll have a supplementary planning document that picks up on biodiversity enhancement. So it's something that you need to consider right from the very start. Certain types of development may be exempt or subject to different rules, like national infrastructure projects and military sites. So HS2 is the obvious one that's actually mentioned within the legislation. And these exemptions are crucial for understanding who must comply and who might not need to. So the thinking behind householder applications and the exemption there is that smaller household projects don't need to meet BNG requirements, and the reason for that is to reduce the burden on individuals that are essentially improving their homes. Now, it may be that if you're building an annex or a building in your garden, depending on the size of the property, that you would then get picked up by BNG. I would reference, I'll put it in the show notes, but I'd refer you back to the Environment Act. We've produced a very, very basic guide. Others have also produced guides, and we'll link to those in the show notes. Achieving biodiversity net gain in smaller schemes is often extremely challenging. You can imagine if you're taking an area of shrubs, tree planting, maybe modified grassland, and you're replacing that with hard surfaces and built footprints, it can be very difficult to achieve the 10% net gain that is required, which is why it's really, really important to make sure that you engage a ecological consultancy to support you very, very early on, maybe even at land acquisition stage, so that they can advise exactly on what needs to be done there. There are certain practical steps that small developers can take to achieve the 10% net gain, such as native species planting, creating green roofs, installing bird boxes, and things like that. If you can't meet the requirement for the 10% net gain on site, you could look at achieving it elsewhere within the same customer's ownership, which is again preferable because then it's close to the existing site. Or you can look at what's known as off-site BNG. So on-site BNG, sort of while off-site contributions like funding for biodiversity projects elsewhere are allowed, the preference is always for on-site biodiversity improvements where possible. And that is obviously really, really important because it will benefit the on-site conservation and on-site local ecosystems and communities. I would emphasise the importance of working with local authorities and a planning consultant on more complicated schemes. I know sometimes it can be like pulling teeth trying to engage with a local authority, but it is best to do that from an early stage to look at how best to integrate BNG into the project plans effectively. Collaboration really does lead to a much more innovative and effective BNG outcome. You'll also need, as part of your team, so you'll have your ecologist, which will do all the baseline work and metric computations. You'll have your planning consultant. You'll also have a landscape architect as well that will assist with building up the habitat plan. And then eventually what would happen is once this goes through and is accepted by the local planning authority, on determination, your habitat plan will be secured through a Section 106 agreement, usually for 30 years. So that is worth bearing in mind. So my personal opinion is that BNG is really important for promoting sustainable development. I don't believe that it should be applied to household applications in any way, shape or form, but we are seeing that. Whether you are a developer or a homeowner, I would have you consider the possibility that it is really, really important to engage with an ecologist early on in the process. Do not submit your documents, sit back and hope for the best. Most local authorities do tend to have information on their websites. I have opened the floor for listener questions. We haven't actually got any come in just yet on BNG, but I'll update that in forthcoming episodes. So I've mostly talked about England there, so let's just briefly touch on the situation in Wales and then Scotland. So as of now, Wales does not have a mandatory biodiversity net gain requirement like England. However, there are biodiversity considerations as part of planning decisions under the Environment of Wales Act 2016, and this includes the principle for sustainable management of natural resources, which is about maintaining and enhancing the resilience of ecosystems. The Welsh Government is exploring the implementation of BNG, and discussions with consultants are ongoing at the moment to determine how BNG might be integrated into Welsh law, thus aligning with existing commitments, but we'll see how that goes. And although BNG is not mandated, some local authorities in Wales do choose to incorporate BNG principles voluntarily into their local development plans, which does reflect a broader commitment to environmental and sustainability goals. So that's the situation in Wales at the moment. It's not Biodiversity Net Gain is not mandatory, but the headline to take away from there is that there are BNG principles incorporated voluntarily into lots of local development plans. Scotland does not have a statutory biodiversity net gain either, in the same way that England does. Scottish planning policy does, however, strongly encourage developments to positively contribute to the environment, which includes enhancing biodiversity where possible. So we also up here have something like the Control of Woodland Removal Act as well. Scottish planning policy emphasises that the planning system should protect, enhance and promote the overall health of biodiversity. So developers are encouraged to integrate natural and green spaces into the project from the outset. So again, getting an ecologist and a landscape architect on board early is helpful. And up here we have Nature Scot that deals with that, formerly Scottish Natural Heritage, and they provide guidance to local planning authorities on how developments can enhance biodiversity and tie in with wider commitments. Scottish planning policy also emphasises the role of community engagement and local development plans in shaping how biodiversity is managed and enhanced, and this approach aims to reflect local priorities and characteristics in biodiversity. So yeah, there are differences. There are differences across the UK. We do have a document that we've put together, which I'll link in the show notes, which may or may not be useful to you. But for those who are listening, who are thinking of submitting a planning application, particularly if it is not a householder application, I strongly suggest that you get an ecology consultancy on board to support you early on. Consider even engaging with them before you purchase the land, because they'll be able to give you some really useful advice on things like trees and ecology. If you would like some help from Rover on that, we have recently released, I'll link in the show notes again, we've recently released a couple of scorecard quizzes which enables you from both a tree and ecology perspective to put your site details through there, and it will spit out a score, and it will show you which areas you're strong in and which areas you're going to need support with. And there's a cool booking link off the back of that if you would like to have a chat with me or one of my team to see how we can help you get your planning back on track. So that's it from me. You know where to go if you need some support, and I'll speak to you next week.